Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of The Great Game, an Australian megagame podcast. In this episode, we're going to be interviewing Justin and James from Sydney Megagames on their game So Say We All. Now, just heads up, this is a podcast we recorded later in December in 2019, so it might be slightly outdated. You know, it was back from the time when we could actually attend megagames in person, so crazy as that seems now. So maybe some slight outdated stuff there. But just a few announcements first. So there's a surprising amount of stuff happening at the end of May, which is really exciting for Mega Games. First up, on May 16th, John Keyworth is going to be doing a playtest of his online mega game, The Anubis Heresy, which is based on but legally distinct from Game Workshop's 40k universe. I played in the first playtest of this one, and it was really awesome. Very great kind of rules light mega game with really awesome technological integration with Roll20. A lot of really cool tech stuff going on there. Definitely check that out if you're interested. It's probably a bit too late to sign up for the playtest itself, but I'm sure once that actually gets going as a full mega game, that'll be posted around the usual places like Mega Game Assembly and Mega Game Makers. Next up, we are actually doing a playtest of our online mega game, Dark and Stormy Nights. That'll be on May 29th, the second playtest, and I'm super excited for it. How do you feel about the first playtest, Pat?
Yeah, I think it went really well. We've got some pretty tight, light mechanics that people really enjoyed, and the players that we got together seem to really take to the theme. So I think it's in good shape, and I'm looking forward to the 29th, where we'll be looking at how it applies to a bit of a longer form game. So it should be good.
Absolutely, super excited for it. Yeah, I think it's. I love the gothic horror theme, and I think we've really focused on keeping it rules light and role play heavy, which I feel like
Mm.
is where these online mega games are really hitting the best. Really, for me at least personally. So excited for that second playtest, and then finally on May the 30th, there's going to be a Mega Games in the Future Symposium by True North Megagames, which looks awesome. It'll just be basically a chat starting at 12 o'clock UK time. I've got it here. There's going to be 4 sections, one on presentations from designers, breakout sessions for upcoming games, an open forum on gender equality in mega games, and a exhibition on the art of mega games. Which all sounds awesome. If you can make it with your time zone, that sounds like a fantastic event, which you can find on the True North Mega Games Facebook page. But without further ado, let's launch into the episode with Justin and James.
Thanks for having the chat with us, guys. If you just want to introduce yourselves.
James.
All right. My name is James Archer. I'm a PhD student, and I've been involved in the Sydney Megagamers for as long as we've been doing events as a player and a moderator.
My name is Justin Delaney. My introduction is identical to James's. I'm also a PhD student. I've also been here since the beginning, and I'm also a player/moderator.
Perfect. So yeah, all of our locals know you guys from the early days, 2014, and now you have designed your first game. So say we all. Did you want to just give a little elevator pitch on that, what it's about?
I think at its core, So Say We All is a game about deceit and mistrust and social deduction. But to make it a little bit more accessible to our predominantly nerdy audience, we've wrapped it in a science fiction inspired by Battlestar Galactica esque kind of wrapper. But yeah, ultimately, it's a social deduction game about trying to figure out who the undercover people are amongst all the other players.
Cool. And just briefly before we jump in, do you think that it achieved that on the day? Was it a social deduction game, and did people get that out of it?
I think so. It took a little while for people to investigate or to flesh out that aspect of the game, but towards the middle and definitely by the end, people were I think, actively feeling out that part of the game, and it became kind of the major focus of everybody rather than resource management or dealing with crises.
I think that once the game got to the point where the infiltrators were messing with the production and the well-being of the fleet enough, that prompted people to start getting really serious about it.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, I thought we might jump in and just quickly talk about. We'll go back a little bit from the event and talk about the design. You've kind of covered a bit there where the core concept of the game has come from, and the theme has been inspired by this sci-fi world from Battlestar Galactica. So, were there any other inspirations that came to you beyond that?
I don't think so. I remember when, in isolation of your own idea, Pat, that you discussed with us, James and I came up with our own idea for a mega game. I think after Unrest in Idranor, and we thought that this sort of situation would be a really good opportunity for a mega game. But I think that was kind of, I would say, probably close to 100% of our inspiration kind of came from Battlestar Galactica. We didn't really pull a lot from anywhere else.
Uh, for me, it was the Battlestar Galactica board game, which sort of is a very basic, well, I'd say basic compared to a mega game, basic introduction to this sort of thing, but only for a couple of players. And I'd always thought doing that, but as a mega game with 30, 40 people would be just a blast.
Right, and a lot of people who would be listening might be familiar with the other mega game based on Battlestar, which is Den of Wolves, which I was lucky enough to play last year, or maybe it was even earlier this year. I'm losing track. But yeah. So and I was very interested when you guys started working on this, and I talked to you about that, and I said, do you want to, do you want to debrief on how Den of Wolves plays and all that? And you really wanted to do it in isolation. Um, so I just thought that was fascinating that there's two different games, and now that I haven't played yours, but from what I've seen, they're pretty different. A lot of similarities because of the theme, but very different outcomes. You mentioned the social deduction side of it, though. Are there any specific games or activities that you pulled from for that, or was it starting from the ground up?
I think we largely started from the ground up. I think in further revisions of the game, I would like to work in a larger focus on that, and I would like it to be a sort of mechanical, possibly a mechanical thing. But no, I think especially with this sort of game and incorporating that sort of social deduction um, aspect into a game with 40 players, there wasn't really anything that had done that before, so there wasn't a lot to borrow from that could reasonably cope with this size of game. So I think largely we just designed it all ourselves.
I think that with a lot of the previous mega games, there's always been people who have been acting counter to everyone else, but it's usually not explicitly stated at the start of the game that there are this many people fulfilling this role. And so having that sort of briefing for all the players really set the scene for the goal of figuring out who's betraying them to try and flush them out.
Out the airlock.
That really is a change of pace for our games because yeah, you're right. We have had a lot where there's discontent or sown within teams or people working against each other or that kind of thing. But it's not usually explicitly this is a key part of the game and you need to deal with it. Just quickly on the development, did you want to just run through the process you went through? Just broad strokes. How did you develop the game? What tools did you use? How did you how did you run through sort of the event management stuff? How did you find that being your first game?
So, luckily, we'd just finished working on As the Fire Dies, led by you, Patrick. So we pretty much emulated your organization style. So everything was run on, hosted on Google Drive that we all had access to. We tried to have everything nice and separated and organized, and try and dish out responsibilities to everyone so that we could get everything done without putting too much time pressure on ourselves at the end. And I will say the last 2 weeks before the game for me was pretty much flat out doing mega game stuff, but I feel like we were quite well prepared overall.
Yeah, I think we were largely on top of it, right up until I'm sure you're familiar with this, Pat. You feel like you're on top of it, and you hit 2 weeks before the game, and you've got to do all like that last minute production, like making the minis and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, I shamelessly ripped off your organizational style that you introduced us to from As the Fire Dies. I think it helped. I think everything was pretty clear.
It was just good having everything there that we could have access to. I didn't have to constantly bother you for any files I needed. I just went on and did it myself. Or if there's anything I wanted to add, I could just add it in. I didn't have to send something to you or wait for this or that. So I think it really helped the workflow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I'm glad that it was successful in that regard, and and also regarding the the last couple of weeks before the game and that last minute rush. I feel I'm really, the more and more I run these things, I'm getting convinced that that's part of the creative process, and you can't, if you don't have it, things won't go well. And the only time that I haven't felt that pressure was with INC, and as you guys know, I feel like that was the game that let me down most. So I think there's something to it that the last minute rush really does indicate that you're about to deliver something big.
I think it's you as you're developing, as you're coming up with ideas and making stuff. There's a lot of things that you're thinking, oh, I'll deal with that later. I'll deal with that later. I'm not sure about that. And then you hit 2 weeks and think, oh, now's the time. I have to force something.
Yeah, can't put off these decisions anymore. It's time to pick something.
And one thing that really stood out for that, in that regard, for this game, was the what the hostile team was going to do. So another thing that's quite different from other mega games is there was the human fleet of survivors with the infiltrators in them, and then there was the bad guys, the so-called Ashiva, who were tasked with hunting down and destroying the humans. So there was a very strong us versus them vibe, which both helped keep the fleet together and foster a bit of cooperativity, cooperation. Edit that out. And it gave us two quite different mechanics to try and figure out. What the human fleet didn't necessarily determine what the Ashiva fleet could do. So how they were going to pass the time and how they were going to go about what they did was sort of, for me, put off a lot until the very end, where we had to nail something down. And luckily, I think we came up with something that worked well in this game, and we had a great group of players on their team who made it work.
Yeah, it's that's also another recurring theme. It seems it's the players that really get their hands dirty and get involved and do some interpretation sometimes, and really drive some of the things you weren't sure would work. On the just the last thing, sort of on the game and the design and everything, before we get into the nitty gritty. I was just going to ask you about the tools of the trade of the day. What kind of technology did you need to use? What kind of props did you have? I've seen we've seen the photos of all the little miniatures. What else did you have going to sort of help aid the game?
So we had as usual, I think in every single mega game that we've run in Sydney, there was a dashboard to help the players keep track of where they were in the game. What turn it was, how long they had left in this turn. Because some aspects of the game, had to be accomplished within a certain time frame. But that was really it in terms of kind of the digital or computerized things that we had there. We just had one dashboard for the human fleet, and then there was a smaller, less intricate dashboard that was also created for the Ashiva team that they could refer to. And then we had the props. Obviously, we had some game maps that we made. We also had some ship cards. So each team had one ship card on their table, and that was used to track both the status of their ship. So if any locations or systems were damaged, and also the number of people they had aboard at any given time, along with where those people were being committed, whether they were being used for resource production or to operate fighter craft or man some weapons or conduct repairs. There were spaces for all of those things on their team cards, and then at various stages throughout the turns, and kind of where the majority of our record keeping was done, the moderators would come around and they would note down these things and then report back to one logistics moderator we had, which with their own table. And every turn they would take this information that the mods had brought them about which team was producing what resource or whether they were upgrading their ship, and they had their own sheet where they would track all of this and control the resource flow into and out of the game to make sure that everything ran smoothly. I think for the most part it worked out all right.
I'll just add for the rulebook. So we just had a regular document for that, just laid out everything in order. What would have been good, I think, is having an online rulebook that was easily searchable or easily indexed. You could jump around to parts and find the rules you're interested in very quickly. Because I found a lot of the conversation I was having with players and even some of our moderators, where they were asking me something, I would just be opening up the rulebook and finding it myself. And so empowering the players and even the mods to be able to do that themselves would take a bit of pressure off us and just give them a bit more to do in their turn if they've got questions.
Yeah, you did have the good idea of printing out quick reference sheets that we kind of scattered around the venue. At the battle maps, we had the rules for combat, which were quickly summarized for players to refer to. And then I think on their tables, we had a short breakdown of how the turns would go.
Yep. So it listed the three phases of the game: reconciliation, negotiation, commitment, and then negotiation. What they should be doing in those phases and things they need to keep track of. So just for the resource production ships, it mentioned that they needed to be putting manpower to produce resources, and they're responsible for, doing whatever they want with those resources once they have them, whether that be to hoard them or to distribute them out to the other ships or to trade for them. So to give them a bit of a prompt to know what they need to do.
Right, that sounds actually really organized. It's the middle ground that I haven't been able to find with some games in the past, between having a really succinct, plain English to the point rulebook and having a really nice, fluffy, fancy one that people can really sink their teeth into, and also having those kind of quick reference guides. So it sounds like that was a good approach to have a good combo of the two.
Yeah, a lot of the development I found personally was trying to balance that, having solid mechanical rules and presenting it to the players in a way that was not dry mechanical, accessible, and in the language of the world. So otherwise it just gets too much like a giant board game, which is not really what a megagame is. So that was a bit of a challenge, and I think having rules that err on the side of simplicity rather than complexity really helps achieve that.
Yeah, great. Okay, we'll move on to get into some of the mechanics a bit more, hear about the rules a little bit. Like you guys have already set the scene. It's this sci-fi game of sort of survival, and one team is pursuing the other. You've got infiltrators, suspicion, paranoia. What would you say are the key mechanical functions of the game? Like, what were the key areas which were running throughout the entire game?
I've prepared a list. And Justin, tell me if there's something I missed. So I pretty much put it down to exploration, combat, production, science, and events. These are sort of the core areas that the players had to address if they wanted to survive and make it out to the end of the game.
Right. Okay. And could you run me through each of those just briefly? What were the players doing in each of those sort of spheres?
So start off with exploration. We had a galaxy map that linked out a number of star systems, and the fleet could do faster than light FTL jumps to different systems and send scouts out to neighboring systems from there. So that was to both find new resources they could use, to advance the plot line we had for them, which was to triangulate their position and eventually try and jump back to Earth, and also to flee the enemy fleet who was hunting them. So each team had a role. The navigations officer who was responsible for that part. The next section was combat. That's if the two fleets meet each other, they would be in combat. And so the communications officer was responsible for managing their ship in the combat theater on the battle map. So independent of the main game timer, we had 30-second turns where each ship had to act. And as they went through in order, each ship would go until all the ships had gone, and then it repeats. So everything's still happening in the background. The rest of their teammates are still doing what they normally do. But hopefully the human fleet in that regard would be trying to organize an FTL jump to escape.
I think it's worth just interjecting here with the combat. One thing that we experimented with, and I think we'll keep it in subsequent games, was the idea that the turn order was not fixed. There was actually a player responsible for choosing the turn order. And every ship, every team had to act before a team could go again. And so first there was a position within the human government called the fleet commander. And in the first round of combat, the human fleet commander would pick the order that everyone acted in. And then once that was over, then the Ashiva fleet commander would pick the new order. And so there was a lot of consideration had to be given to, a lot of judicious decisions had to be made, especially in like the end game combats where resources were running thin and the fleet was barely keeping going.
Right. Okay. Sounds like a unique approach to that sort of initiative order for combat. What were and did you say science was another jurisdiction?
Yep. So science, the fleet would need to generate research points to unlock new technologies. There was a chief scientist as another government position who was responsible for organizing that. So the way that the fleet would generate science is they could assign manpower on the military ship, the prosecutor, to generate a little bit of science each turn. But some of the civilian ships could respec their production into research and generate a lot more. And they would just get points, and then every 6 points they generated, just an arbitrary number, they would unlock a new few technologies that the chief scientist could choose from to open up.
And then science also became important. So I tried to tie in some of these like satellite aspects into the main objectives that the human players had, which was they had a threefold objective going into the game. So the first one, as James has already touched on, they had to figure out where they were relative to Earth so they could return, and that was accomplished just by exploration. And then once they figured out where they were, they had to calculate. They had to do the jump calculations, figure out the course and the optimum trajectory and other sciencey buzzwords in order to get back to Earth. And the way they accomplished that was they had to generate a large amount of science points. So, because I was conscious that something like, technology progression is often on the fringes of a mega game. It's only a few teams seem to, really bite into it. So I wanted some way to bring it to the forefront so that everyone would be kind of invested in the progress of the fleet. And I think that sort of happened once the players propagated that information out that they needed to just start generating research points in bulk. Everyone kind of got behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. That sounds really good. That's often a sort of a misgiving of some rule sets and designs where there's little sub games. I'm definitely guilty of it. Sub games that don't have a big picture connection, so they can easily just fall to the wayside if certain people aren't involved in them. So that sounds really good. Did you have a few other jurisdictions?
So we had production. So that was based on the manpower that each ship had available, committing them to certain tasks to produce resources that were required for survival. So the two resources we had were food and fuel. We tried to keep it simple. I think we've learned from some previous mega games that having too many resources and too many things to do with them, you do have a lot of things that do get ignored, and it becomes a bit cumbersome, both logistically for the moderator team and for the players to handle all that. So we tried to keep it simple with just food and fuel. All the people needed to be fed with food. So that's pretty simple. And if the ships needed to do an FTL jump, each ship needed a certain amount of fuel to make that jump. Apart from that, resolving events required food, fuel, and manpower, as well as missing something, and upgrades. Upgrades required fuel to complete. So that's the main production side, and the thing here is that there are some ships that produce certain resources, and some ships that don't produce any unless they specifically outfit themselves for it. So there is an inherent imbalance in the resource production in the game, and so that gives some players or some teams an opportunity for trading or for extortion or for leverage, and others are challenged that they need to solve. They need food and they need fuel. And we found that the game ended up pretty cooperative, and I think that's because there was a overall excess of resources being available, to the point where at the end, when the fleet needed to make the final jump, they were struggling for fuel. There was still mostly enough around, but one ship had been hoarding a lot of fuel, we learnt at the very end.
Classic Sydney Megagamers behavior.
Yeah.
That sorry, just before we move on, because I think you do have a few others on the list, but regarding that abundance of resources that came through in the day, was that planned or was that unintentional?
Yeah, so when we designed the game, we like crunched the numbers and figured out, what the consumption would be. If they had to feed 58 manpower per turn, they would need to be producing that amount of food. Otherwise, they would start like spiraling, and they wouldn't be able to recover from it. And likewise with fuel, overall the fleet required a certain amount of fuel to perform an FTL jump, and so if we wanted them to be able to jump, once per turn, they would need to be able to produce a certain amount of fuel. And then, there are other miscellaneous things that cost those resources as well, like events, or, there can be player-driven things that crop up. And to be safe, we thought, well, it was best to key it so there was, if the fleet was running at its maximum capacity for resource production, like just using the dedicated resource ships, that they could keep themselves afloat and make a tiny bit of surplus. But if one of those dedicated resource ships went down, then everyone else would have to pitch in to pick up the slack, and it would become a much more difficult situation. But we thought that it would be too difficult if the dedicated resource production ships couldn't support the fleet, then it would restrain or restrict the players from dealing with events or doing upgrades, or or coming up with player driven things that they want to conduct. If we say that's going to cost 3 fuel and the fleet doesn't have 3 fuel spare, I think that would restrict player engagement, so we decided consciously to provide them with a little bit of a surplus.
I'd say that surplus is just regards to the baseline feeding in all the people and doing the jumps that they needed. And we should move into events, because that's the other area where the resource would be spent. So we had a number of pre-written events that were either challenges or opportunities, which would either give the players an option to invest their resources to get something, or to invest their resources to negate a negative effect. So that pretty much gave the other outlet for their resources to be spent. So we just had at most 2 events happening at a time, and the events coming out were largely determined by the status of the fleet and the fleet morale, which was a vague idea that we didn't really follow too strongly during the game, because things get a bit out of hand and chaotic. But that sort of determined what events came out. If they had good morale, they should be getting opportunities and positive events. If they had low morale, they should be having challenges. So that would encourage the fleet to do things to keep morale high, which executing random players did not. So that happened a bit. So that wasn't super successful, but that's something we've learned from.
And so, okay, so you've run me through the five. Are there, those the five key sort of spheres of mechanics?
That's what I wrote down.
Yeah.
Justin, is there anything major sort of missed?
No, I think that pretty much covers most of the game. If we forgot something, it was probably very minor, and we might be able to touch on it later.
Right. Okay. Well, just before we move into talking about the actual day, a few weeks ago when you ran this, which of those five do each of you sort of relate to most? Which do you think was the most successful, or the most fun, or even just the most enjoyable to design?
Probably the combat, I think. Well, that was what I had the most involvement with during the day. So James and I have both kind of uh, shared what you typically assign as like the lead mod role. Because we both, were heavily involved in designing it, we figured it would just make sense if, there were two people around to put out fires instead of one. But also, as part of our kind of purview that we assigned to ourselves on the day, we would also facilitate uh, fleet combat, which we anticipated, I think, correctly as being, potentially one of the most, intense situations where you have to really know the rules and make quick decisions. And so I kind of ended up just taking over that while James went around and did other stuff and occasionally updated me on what was going on. But I think, yeah, we did some play testing and design work, and I think what we came up with was pretty balanced overall. I think it worked quite smoothly and seamlessly, and a lot of the players said they enjoyed it. Um, so I think that worked pretty well.
Yeah, the challenge with designing the combat was that we wanted the fleet to have a feeling of danger, and we didn't want them trying to stand and fight. We wanted them to feel like they had to flee. So during the combat, we needed them to not have an advantage, but also not be so disadvantaged that they could be easily destroyed and ruin the game in the first combat. So that took a bit of work, and I think we got it to the point where it did go pretty well with that. Although one thing I heard as feedback from the Ashiva team was that the way the combat turns happened, the human fleet commander would determine the order of all the ships, including when the Ashiva ships went, and then the Ashiva fleet commander would do the same thing after everyone's gone. So they would have a chance to attack first on the next round. However, I heard that the human fleet managed to get away generally before the Ashiva got to have a turn, so there wasn't much chance for them to do stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, but I'm going to try and absolve myself of any responsibility here. I think that largely um, came down to a few things. There were 3 turns in a row where the Ashiva was tracking the human fleet and basically just followed them through jumps from system to system. So there were 3 consecutive turns of combat. During this time, none of the Ashiva infiltrators, bothered to try and sabotage the ships. And so, like, I guess it does point out that, yeah, we could have balanced it a little bit more, but I think there was probably ample opportunity to cripple at least one ship and kind of force the humans to dig in for at least one round of combat rather than letting them all get away. Um, but yeah, ultimately I think it was still the best choice. I couldn't think of a fairer way to do combat other than just randomly assigning it every single combat, but I thought that would have been a bit too clunky.
I feel like there
And
might be a way to, sorry to interrupt, just to
yep,
add, distribute out the Ashiva ships more throughout the turn order. And I don't have a suggestion for that or how to do that mechanically, but I think having them acting, if they have 2 ships, sometime in the first half of the round and then sometime in the second half of the round, so that you're always going to have them acting before some of the human ships, and I think that would make it a bit more interesting.
yeah, I suppose, and we could just have that, seeing as they typically are always the ones initiating combat, they could have just by default one of their ships always gets to go first, and then the human fleet commander picks the order.
So speaking of future games, it sounds like Justin, you're saying that the combat was sort of your most invested part of the game, and it sounds like it went pretty well, all things considered. Are you in a similar boat, James, or do you have any other highlights from the design process? Or
I enjoyed working with all the technologies and the science, and it was a lot of fun coming up with what they could upgrade and how it would affect the fleet and give them an advantage without being too powerful. And of course, that was one of the mechanics that they only got a few of the technologies rather than a lot of them. So it's a little not disappointing, but you always like to see them do more.
Yeah, I'm noticing that's been a bit of a recurring thing. We had a similar issue with As the Fire Dies, where we came up with all these things they could do, and they only got to explore a small amount of it. I think the underlying causes are largely similar, in that the player that was in charge of that, maybe had in So Say We All, the person who was ultimately in charge of directing the research efforts, which is the president, telling the chief scientist what to do. The president was for most of the game an infiltrator, so I think they did a really good job of obstructing the development of the technologies by kind of distracting the chief scientist with other things.
One thing that I loved from the game on that note was the president had a basic Ashiva detector technology, so they could once per turn, once every 30 minutes, pick one of the ships in the fleet, and they would be told whether there was an infiltrator on the crew of that ship or not. And so our infiltrator president came to me for 3 turns in a row and said, that ship, that ship, that ship. And she managed to pick all 3 other infiltrators in the first 3 picks. So, and she didn't tell anyone what she'd learned, obviously. So I'd say that technology was used in an interesting way. Not what we were anticipating, but that was a lot of fun to experience.
I am sad that they never got to the. So there was a second tier of that where the president could test individual players, but that never came up in technology, unfortunately. But implementing that had another aspect of the game that comes to mind now that I enjoyed developing, similar to one that I developed in As the Fire Dies, which was the executive order system. And some of these technologies, especially the president's, especially the individual like Ashiva detector technology, required the president to pass a law, basically, curtailing the rights of the fleet's citizens. And so there were a few instances of that. The unfortunately, much the same with the technologies, the president didn't really feel out a lot of them. When they did, it was often humorous and funny, especially the very last law that the president passed, which I think everyone got a good chuckle out of. So what happened was I'll just quickly segue into that. There was the only way to weed out infiltrators was the captain of a ship could imprison a player, and then after jumping through some other hoops, if the captain that had imprisoned them believed that they were an infiltrator, they could flush them out the airlock. And this happened a few times to no success. I think three human players in a row were airlocked.
I believe so.
And so things were getting bad. So the president passed a law that enhanced the civil rights of people in the fleet, so they could no longer be imprisoned. And everyone was happy, sort of. They didn't quite realize that they'd lost their kind of major weapon. And then right towards the end of the game, the same president, did a complete 180, and she repealed that law and brought in one that allowed the president to summarily execute people without imprisoning them, and immediately exercised that on 2 players. And nobody seemed to bat an eye. I think everyone, and I think unwittingly picked one of the infiltrators, and she picked one human player, and just immediately threw him straight out the airlock.
It is always interesting, both with that sort of story and going back to what you're talking about with the technologies, what players do with the ideas that you give them, and also the things that they never reach. You were saying how we saw that in As the Fire Dies. I saw it a lot in For the Crown as well, and I think there's a bit of a fog of war that you get in when you're designing things where you know everything and you have all this knowledge, and sometimes it's easy to forget or anticipate how the players are meant to connect those dots. I know I do that a lot. And so I'm always surprised and taken aback, but I shouldn't be, when players just don't unlock that extra thing or they don't think that maybe something might be possible, so they pursue it. Um, the world is their oyster, and they've always got crazy, crazy ideas and interpretations, and it keeps you on your feet, to say the least.
We give them a lot of tools that they can use and things for them to do, and then they go and come up with other completely ridiculous, unanticipated things that they want to do just to make
Yeah,
it difficult.
exactly.
I
Yeah,
think I always enjoy like seeing the wacky things that players come up with.
Oh,
Though.
it's the epitome of a mega game.
So I might just segue us in. What I was going to ask there, was just about the mechanics. You've talked a fair bit about how it all worked, how you designed it, and it sounds like you're pretty happy with a lot of it. Just broadly speaking, would you go and run this again, in a couple of weeks, or do you think it needs a bit of work?
I think we could. I think
Yep.
there's some minor refinement. There were some areas that maybe weren't fully realized, as we've already like outlined, or that players weren't satisfied with. But I think I would say, and I hope James agrees, that we could probably run this almost kind of out of the box again, if we had to, with minimal tuning and refinement.
Yeah, I agree. There's obviously a lot of things in hindsight that you would change, but I think it's if we had to, we could absolutely run it again with not too many changes. Uh, a few things that did stand out were, so I'll explain some of the restrictions and rules we had. So for players to travel between different ships in the game, they needed shuttle cards. So that was to try and stop people just running everywhere they wanted to go without some sort of mechanic for that. And we also wanted players to be able to, we wanted a player to stay on their ship at all times. So we had the rule that at least one player had to be at their table at all times. So this led to a lot of players sitting around doing nothing, which was not what we want, obviously. And so that's something I think possibly needs some revision. And while I'm not ready to throw out the rules for keeping a player at their table and the having the shuttle cards and only a few per ship for them to travel around with, I think changing the responsibilities of the different roles of the players would help that a lot.
Yeah, I agree.
So one thing that stood out was the battle map was only accessible by the comms officers, and the navigation, the galaxy map was only accessible by the navigation officers. And the captain didn't really have that many mechanical things that they could do that was exclusive to them. So I think one simple change would be allowing the captain to go view those maps if their officer was there, and while not interact with it the same way that the specific officer could, they could get an overview of what was happening in the combat or with the exploration, what the plans were, and relay that to the rest of their team, or give them a better overview to do their captainly duties.
You're right. Okay, well, it sounds really positive, that you guys have already put some thought into how you could tweak things or improve things, and you did send that survey out and get a lot of feedback that I've heard is pretty positive and constructive. So I think that's a really good sign, especially since this was kind of your first design, that it's so tight and ready to go again. That's great. I just thought, just before we wrap up, thought we'd talk about the day itself. Any highlights? How did the logistics at the venue go? Would you use that again? Anything that popped up that just you had to throw out and improvise because of hindsight? Major lessons learned. How did the day sort of teach you?
Well, I think something we knew going in from our experience with As the Fire Dies, and also participating in all of your previous games, is that no mega game ever proceeds without some sort of issues, that are not related to the game itself.
I think there's a sorry to interrupt. I think the UK lads have a saying that no mega game survives first contact with the players, and I think it's pretty true.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But yeah, so say we all was no exception. We had some. Ultimately, it ended up being quite minor issues that I don't think derailed the game too much. It was more just kind of it. It took us a little bit to deal with it, so I think the game got started a little bit later than we wanted to, but it didn't hurt us too much in the end. But yeah, I don't think there was anything major we encountered. James, you want to add anything before we get into the actual events of the day?
Yeah, I just have to say the space was pretty good for what we wanted. We needed to have the Yeshiva team away from the other players, and so we had them off in a different room, and that gave them both the privacy to scheme their own schemes. It kept them separate from the humans, so they couldn't overhear anything they shouldn't have. And once combat started, they could march down the hallway, making a big fuss, and get everyone to their battle stations, which was always fun.
Yeah, I agree. I think the venue was aside. Once we got the kind of that initial issue out of the way, I think the venue itself was actually really, really good. There was a lot of space, so we could kind of have the things we wanted to be separate, we could have them separate, and the things we wanted to be really close together, we could have close together, and they didn't really, you didn't have to have players that were supposed to be in two different areas kind of trying to shout over each other. So I think that, the actual setup of the day of the space was really good.
One, I guess, setup and venue related thing that I would mention is I think having a microphone or some sort of PA system that the players can just use whenever they want would really help communicate what's going on in the fleet. So when players want to make an announcement or they just need to make something known, just let them get up and say something that everyone has to hear. It would have helped with us making announcements. We had to shout over people. And I think that would help them control the narrative of the game themselves a bit more, which I think is always a good thing if the players sort of take over what the story is and how everything's being communicated. Take some work off our hands, and I think it's just a fun thing for the players.
Yeah, for sure. It's always made a big difference for the events that I've run that you guys have probably witnessed as well. The ones where we did have that kind of tool at hand, it's made a big difference.
Yeah.
And likewise in the game that the few games that I've played in myself, especially over in Wellington with Den of Wolves, as the admiral of the fleet, it was really useful for that tool to be there for me. So I think it's a really quick win to add a lot to the game. So event wise, each of you, top moment, what would you say? And will you disagree?
Top moment. Yeah, my top moment was towards the very end of the game. The human fleet had just finished its calculations for the return jump, and they'd figured out the amount of fuel they would need, and they didn't have enough at the time, so it was time to really knuckle down on the fuel production. And one of the dedicated fuel producing ships, the Harry Stamper, they were pretty confident that they didn't have any infiltrators aboard, so they quarantined themselves. So players were not allowed to visit their table, so they were relatively safe from hostile action. But then the executive officer of the prosecutor, who controls the guns and who was an infiltrator, turned to me and said, "I want to destroy that ship." And they blew it up in front of the rest of the fleet and took out a significant chunk of the fleet's fuel and crippled its fuel producing capabilities. It's pretty great.
Amazing.
And he got away with it for far longer than he should have.
It's definitely the kind of catastrophe you can't really write in, that having someone deep cover like that and then making that decision, it's a pretty good way to go out. James, do you have any other highlights, or would you agree with that?
That was a pretty great moment. But for me, my favorite moment was the ending. So we decided near the end of the game, actually, we didn't really plan this out, that once the fleet was ready to make the final jump back to Earth, we were going to bring in the Yeshiva fleet, who would have detected the FTL drive spooling up for a big
Yeah,
jump or
they
some
had
other
been tracking them.
nonsense.
They actually found them the turn beforehand. And then
Okay.
with some quick decision making from myself and Griff, who was the moderator overseeing the Ashiva team, he managed to convince them to hold off for one turn and come in as the fleet was trying to jump away.
So that gave the ending of the game a bit of flavor. So they had the final combat where all the ships were trying to make that final jump, and the Ashiva team were trying to stop them. And at that point, we gathered everyone around the combat table, and it was really fun as each ship got the chance, and they successfully made the jump out. There's lots of cheering, and they were happy. And yeah, I think it was a really, really good way to end the game. Some things that one of the important things I learned from this game is that the players love having a solid ending like that, which is really hard to do, I think, in pretty much all the other mega games we've had, but it just sort of fell into place for this one that we could do it. So I'm not sure how generally applicable that is to just running other mega games, but we were lucky in this case, and I think it gave the players a really satisfying ending to the day.
Yeah, and you guys are aware that I've been having that conversation and that thought process of how you apply narrative and endings and that kind of thing, story arcs. It's constant feedback from people, and sometimes it's a very difficult thing to balance with this game. I think you're right. The setting does lend itself to that because it's my experience in Den of Wolves was very, very similar at the end of the game, orchestrated or not. I don't think it was. It was very similar. There was ships exploding. There was one final jump. There was everyone, the warship hanging around, waiting for everyone to get out. And it was very emotive. Like, it was a very immersive moment. So yeah, definitely that sort of setting really lines that up, and it sounds like it was a good time. I saw all the photos of that last round, and it did look like a bit
I
of a
believe,
highlight.
James, you got a video of the entire thing, didn't you?
Yeah, I might cut that down and post something up.
Yeah, perfect. That'd be great. All right. Well, we should probably start wrapping ourselves up, but I just wanted to thank you guys for coming and having a chat. I wanted to ask you what's next. This was your first design. It was your second time being involved behind the scenes, and it was your sixth game or seventh maybe. What's happening next for you two?
James, you can go first.
So, yep, I'll be hanging around Sydney Megagamers and hopefully helping you, Pat, run 4 games next year, including a rerun of So Say We All. So I'm keen to have another look over the rules, tighten things up, make a few changes, and get that ready for another game.
Amazing. Yep, that sounds really good. And Justin?
Yeah, unfortunately, I will not be able to hang around as part of Sydney Megagamers. I'm going to be moving to Adelaide in a few months. But all is not lost. If all goes well, you might hear of the fledgling Adelaide Megagamers cropping up sometime next year. I'll definitely be looking to run So Say We All again, but I've started coming up with some of my ideas for some new mega games as well. So I'm going to look into fleshing those out. See, I have to find some new friends, some new moderators to help me, and then we'll see if we can get some interstate mega games going.
We'll have to start hunting for some cheap flights to Adelaide. That sounds really good. Very exciting. It's really an era of mega games. I think for us, Melbourne and Brisbane are just taking off the same way we are, and we've got some people in Perth starting to talk about it.
Create the Australian Mega Gamers Society.
That's right. That's the next step. All right, awesome. Well, thank you both. Do you have anything? No, you've just kind of done that. Yeah. Thank you both for chatting. Thanks for designing the game, the first game that has been run in Sydney by our group that I didn't have to put blood, sweat, and tears into.
I feel like we were worse off for it though, Pat. I feel like we need you. You're a crucial part of the mega game environment.
Well, it's arguable, but I'm trying to get away from that as much as possible. I promise. But yeah, thank you both.
That's right. I'm gonna quickly thank our moderator team who helped us on the day. I think thank you to Tony, Ali, Steve, Sash, Griff, and Megan for helping us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the major reason why the game went so well was the amazing job that they did helping us run it. Yeah, without them, this game wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much, guys, for giving your time and helping facilitate this.
Yeah, I want to particularly single out Matt Griffiths for he did a lot of work on the Shiva gameplay. So for them, we had a lot of events that they would he would narrate out to them, and they would make decisions, and he would reward them with certain things, or it would lead to different things they could do. And he pretty much came up with all the ideas and ran that.
Yeah, he really
and
took
kept
that
them
and ran with
entertained
it
the whole day. So he did a really good job with that. And I also want to specifically thank Stephen Hughes, one of the moderators, for spending the last week before the game
making all the minions.
pedantically picking apart all our rules and pointing out all the things we hadn't thought of or all the ways they could be exploited. And it really helped tighten up the game. And there were a few things that did pop up on the day that were sorted out.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you've known Steve's been on your mod teams before, Pat, and he just has a real talent for like picking problems that you haven't noticed and highlighting issues that players will no doubt pounce on.
Yes, definitely. I've been through that gauntlet. And yeah, and I can echo the sentiments. Like, it's really important having a good team who are really invested in it, and they always are. We get some really good sorts through our community, so that's awesome. All right, thanks, guys. Hopefully, I'll see you both soon, and I'm looking forward to So Say We All again next year. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the Adelaide Megagames.
Hopefully.
Thank you very much, Matt.
All right, thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
Pat.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again for tuning in and listening. A quick correction this week from our previous episode where Jack and I talked about getting started with mega games. I referred everyone to a game called Relics of the Fall, which is a mega game by Crisis Games. And I incorrectly mentioned that it was actually inspired by the board game Scythe, which I believe there is a mega game out there of that variety. But Relics of the Fall is actually a post-apocalyptic fusion of Mad Max meets MechWarrior. It's been run a couple of times in the UK. It's available on the Mega Game Assembly site. It's also right over there on the Crisis Games website. And there's links to both of them in the description. So apologies for that, and thanks for the correction. Tune in next episode. Jack and I are going to follow up our getting started discussion, and we're going to move on to looking at our design process and what that looks like and how we sort of get from concept to game day. So hopefully you'll tune in then.